This video will introduce the curved cyclic skies exposure and GIS controls and how to adjust the exposure of your scene. First, open exposure settings. Here, the common exposure parameters in post-process are integrated into the panel for us to adjust directly. They have the same names and functions as in post-process. Exposure compensation, it can directly control the overall brightness of the screen. Exposure compensation curve, it is mainly used to control the brightness difference between day and night in CCS. When we open the curve, the rightmost point represents the daytime exposure bias. The leftmost point represents the nighttime exposure bias. There's about 2.5 difference between them. This means that the luminance at night will be 2.5 exposure compensation lower than daytime, resulting in a darker overall image at night. Let's try it. Open the adaptation display. It shows the current exposure compensation value. When we switch to night, the overall brightness is much lower than the daytime. The exposure compensation shown is about 2.5 lower. Highlight contrast scale and shadow contrast scale control the tolerance of the light and dark parts respectively. Now they're adjusted to 1. Let's find a position with the large light ratio to illustrate. Usually during the day, the light ratio is very large, and we do not want the shadow area to be too dark. We can adjust exposure compensation. But then the sunlit area has been too bright. So we restore exposure compensation. We can adjust the shadow contrast scale to increase the brightness of the dark area, and then adjust the highlight contrast scale to decrease the brightness of the bright area. This way we have a wider dynamic range to accommodate more brightness changes. However, too low a value will result in a lack of contrast in the image, so you need to choose the right value. Max EV100 is used to control the auto exposure limit at the brightest point. For example, let's set max EV100 to 20 and set the time to noon, the brightest time of the day. At this point, auto exposure will balance the brightness of the image so that we look similar to other times of day. However, usually at midday outdoors, the light is so strong that our eyes will feel the glare. To show this, we can turn down the max EV100 value. So that auto exposure will not balance the brightness beyond this value, resulting in an overly bright image. Similarly, my EV100 is used to control the auto exposure limit at the darkest point. Below this brightness value, auto exposure will not boost the brightness and we get a dark night image. The CCS already controls the exposure method as auto exposure histogram. What if we want to use the manual method? We can adjust min EV100 and max EV100 to the same value so that the range of auto exposure will be limited. And then adjust the exposure compensation just like the manual way to control. The other parameters are the same as those in post-process, so we won't introduce them here. Next, let's look at the GI settings. Here are the settings related to lumen's global illumination, which affects the brightness of the screen in non-sunlit areas. These areas are not illuminated by sunlight, and their brightness is determined by skylight and indirect light. Sun indirect lighting intensity and lumen diffuse color boost adjust the intensity of indirect lighting. They have different functions, so let's try them out. Find a suitable location where the sunlight hits a small area and most of the area is illuminated by indirect light. Sun indirect lighting intensity increases only the indirect light produced by the sun, resulting in an effect on a smaller area. If you want to emphasize the bounce light of the sun, it is very suitable. Lumen diffuse color boost increases all indirect light and is suitable for large areas of darkness. They can quickly increase the brightness of dark areas, but should be used in moderation. Too high a value may cause darker areas to appear brighter than areas with bounced light, which can look strange in some scenes, like this area under the bridge where they wouldn't be this bright in reality. Lumen skylight leaking and lumen full skylight leaking distance are used to diminish the ambient occlusion of lumen so that some narrow corners will not be too dark, and in some scenes with more plants you can avoid large areas of dark plant. Too large a value will make the screen lose its darkness and reduce the sense of realism. Next, let's look at the parameters of ray tracing. The default range of lumen in software ray tracing mode is 200 meters. The scene will lose the lumen effect if it exceeds this distance. You can increase it to 800 meters by lumen scene view distance. In hardware light tracing mode, the range of lumen is affected by the ray tracing distance. Let's take an example. Look at the bottom of the viaduct in the distance. You will see some brightness problems in the distance. This is due to the fact that this area is beyond the ray tracing distance. Lumen is not working. In the city sample, the ray tracing culling radius is set to 15,000, which is 150 meters. This is a very close distance, but it reduces ray tracing consumption and relies on HLOD to produce a low quality ray tracing effect in distant areas. This is a good real-time solution. Let's run it. We'll see that the distant brightness problem is solved. The running state of the far view will switch to HLOD and lumen will continue to work. But baking HLOD takes a lot of time, especially for this kind of large scene. If you don't have much time to make HLOD, we can adjust the proper hardware ray tracing culling radius, which is a quick way. The engine default distance is 300 meters. This distance can be extended in CCS by increasing the hardware ray tracing culling radius, which only works if enable ray tracing culling radius is checked. Let's enable it now. The ray tracing distance is now extended to 300 meters, which looks much better already. Note that further away, they will still change by increasing the value. Another thing to note is that the lumen reflections also change with the ray tracing distance. Increasing the distance will result in better telephoto results and more realistic reflections, but it will cause more performance consumption. So you need to be flexible with the settings according to your need. Relying on these exposure anti-controls, CS can achieve good auto exposure in most scenes, especially large scenes like city sample, which hardly need to place a separate post-process volume to control the exposure. But of course, you can also use them together to achieve the desired effect.